We'll start. All right. So let me start with a review from last time. It's only been 2 weeks, but it seems like a lot longer. I'll tell you, the only thing bad about being in Hawaii last week was I missed all of you. I really did think about you. You would think that with all that beautiful surrounding in Hawaii, you wouldn't, but a large part of my week is devoted to preparing lectures and preparing material and going over it and whatnot. So there was, as you might guess, a big gap in my time last week when I didn't have to prepare any lectures or any materials. But I did think of all of you a lot and commiserated with those of you who were back here because the weather seemed to be a little colder here where you were than where we were. So let me review briefly where we were. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the aftermath of the defeat of the Israelite tribes by the Philistines. And I told you we had come to the lowest point probably in the period of the Judges. The Philistines had entered into a major conflict with the tribes of Israel. There was a major battle. And as you remember in the battle, not only were many casualties exacted from among the Jewish people at the time, but also the two sons of Eli the priest, Hophni and Pinchas, both of them died in the course of trying to defend the Ark of the Covenant from being captured. And then, despite all of that, they failed. The Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant with them captive back to their native cities. And when Eli the priest, who had been waiting to hear news from the battle, when he had heard that Israel had suffered a tremendous defeat, that his two sons had died in the same day, and that the Ark of the Covenant had been captured, in shocked reaction, he falls backwards, he breaks his neck, he dies. And then the last episode you'll remember was that his daughter-in-law, who suddenly it gives birth as a result of all of the strain, she in her dying breath names her child who she has given birth to Ichabod, which means without glory, without honor, because she remembers the fact that the birth of the son commemorates a day of great sorrow for herself personally and for the Jewish people as a whole. And then I think we managed to get a little beyond it, thank heaven we did. And I told you the fate of what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. We talked about the fact that the Philistines brought this Ark back. They initially took it to one of their cities, and then they kept moving the location of the Ark because inevitably, time after time, disaster struck the cities. We are told that in the first instance, they set up the Ark in Ekron to Dagon, their god, and they woke up one day and they found that their idol had fallen over in front of the Ark of the Covenant. They attempted to set it back up again and to reestablish it. It fell over again, this time cutting off its hands and its head. And then started a series of plagues. We talked about the fact that the Philistine cities, each of the 5 major Philistine cities, were afflicted with this terrible plague, which we euphemistically sometimes refer to as hemorrhoids. It's a lot more serious than that. I did a little research on it, by the way, to make sure that I was not giving you bad information. And it turns out that the Hebrew word ophalim, which is what these things were called, they were called 2 things. One were called tachtonim, which means that they were struck underneath, below, which is where I guess they get the hemorrhoids from. But the word ophalim really means in Hebrew swellings. And it's as I thought, it refers to the swellings in the body. And it probably did refer to some version of the bubonic plague. According to my research, a bubonic plague is accompanied by swellings of the lymph nodes, often in the armpit and the groin area. That may explain the bottom. And what happens is, as a symptom of the plague, these swellings occur. So it sounds as if, given the fatality of the disease and its seriousness, and its duration, it lasted for 7 months, that this was a long-lasting plague that afflicted the Philistines. And you'll remember that when they decide to send the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel, back to the territory of Israel, the priests and the diviners of the Philistines say, well, when you send it back, you've got to send back an offering as well. You've got the God of Israel angry at you, so you've got to offer some kind of guilt offering. You have to send something back. And you remember they sent back 5 ophalim, 5 swellings, 5 gold swellings, and 5 mice. And even that's suggestive because The gold swellings symbolize the affliction, the plague that had hit them. And the word mice, where does mice come from? Well, the word achbarim, which means mice, it also means rats, probably refers to the agents. They probably made the association. Now, once you realize that the bubonic plague started in the Philistine cities, it probably means it was there from the water. Just like the bubonic plague was brought over water to Europe in the 14th century, it probably was the case that the Philistine cities that were all located by the sea, they were all located on the coast of Israel, probably about the time this took place, they were infected with bubonic plague. You'll remember that the plague starts in the Philistine cities, and that when they move the ark to Israel, the Israelites are suddenly afflicted. It sounds like a contagion transfer. So it was very interesting that we decided that after a period of about 7 months, when the plague had exacted quite a toll, the Philistines just seemed to agree that they were being visited with all these terrible afflictions because they had had the audacity to dishonor the God of Israel. And they learned an important lesson. You may dishonor the people of Israel, you may defeat them and beat them, but watch who you're messing with when you try and mess with their God. And so after all these months of waiting, they decided to return the Ark of the Covenant back to the land of Israel. And they asked the priests and the diviners, how should we do it? And you'll remember the instructions. They say, okay, here's how you do it. You take the Ark of the Covenant and you put it in a new wagon. You don't want to dishonor God by putting it in an old wagon. Get a new wagon, okay? And put the Ark in the wagon. And then it says, in addition to this wagon, you're going to have these offerings, these 5 golden swellings and these 5 golden mice. You're going to put them in an ergos. Ergos can mean in a basket or in a saddle bag. And you're going to deposit that right next to the Ark in the cart. And then you're going to get 2 cows who have never drawn the yoke before, meaning you haven't used them for anything else before. They're going to take this ark, this wagon, and they're going to take this back, and you're going to return the whole thing. You're going to let the oxen go where they want, and if they go back to the land of Israel, it's a sign that this was the reason for our suffering. And if it returns back to Israelite territory, hopefully when the ark is back and God is appeased, that he will remove our suffering from us. That was the theory behind it. And as a matter of fact, that's where we left off last time. The people in a place called Beit Shemesh, they're doing their harvesting. They're taking care of their crops. And what did they see? Suddenly this wagon led by 2 oxen is pulling up the road, carrying, to their surprise and shock, the Ark of the Covenant. And they look and they say, the ark that was taken by the Philistines all those months ago, it's been returned, it's coming back, it's a miracle. So what do? When the wagon gets there, obviously they're rejoicing, they want to spread the news, they send messengers out. So they take the wagon itself and they break it down and they take the wood of the wagon along with other wood, and they make a fire with it to offer up offerings, including the 2 oxen that they're brought back. And they take the ark and they place it on a rock, and they take the offerings that the Philistines had brought, these gold objects, out of the basket, and they're celebrating and they're offering and they're rejoicing. And what's the aftermath of that? We're told suddenly they're struck with a plague. Okay, so this great miracle that the Ark of the Covenant has been retrieved from the enemy and it's been restored. No sooner do they celebrate, no sooner do they come together and acknowledge God and thank God for the return of the ark by offering up offerings. Right after that, we're told over 50,000 people are stricken with the plague or stricken with this affliction in Beit Shemesh. Well, of course, the people have a problem. Why is this happening to us? We welcomed the ark back. We celebrated, we offered up offerings to God, we said prayers, we offered thanksgivings. Why is this terrible affliction occurring to us? And what are we going to do about it? And that's the first question for tonight. Question number 1. What happened after the Ark of the Covenant was returned by the Philistines to the town of Beit Shemesh? We know that a plague broke out. how did the inhabitants of Beit Shemesh understand the plague? What did they think about the plague? Why did it occur? And how did they deal with it? Joseph, go ahead, you start.
What I read in my Bible, it said, and I don't know if this is a separate occurrence, but that a number of people of the village looked into the ark and they interpreted that you cannot look into the face of God, and that's why they were struck down. Is that a separate occurrence, or do you think that's the same thing that happened?
Well, I think that's exactly what the text says, although some words are added. The text in Samuel chapter 6, verse 19 says, and he, meaning God, smote the men of Beit Shemesh because they peered into the ark of the Lord. Peered in parentheses, disrespectfully. Remember, the ark of the Lord is sacred, okay? This is something special. Remember, it wasn't in plain view. During the years of the tabernacle, the ark was kept in a special chamber called the Holy of Holies in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. Normal people didn't have contact with it. The only people who touched it were the priests who carried it. The only people who ever would see it would be the priests who served before it. Otherwise, when it moved, it was covered with drapery when it was moved. The ark was a sacred object. People were not supposed to just gaze at it. And obviously, never having seen the ark up close before, when the people saw it and it was right there, they didn't treat it with the respect that it was due. That's their understanding of it. Their understanding was, what did we do that caused this terrible plague to befall us? We're happy it's back. The answer was they didn't deal respectfully with the ark, whether they actually looked inside. And if they looked inside, what would they have seen? Tablets of the covenant. Unlike Indiana Jones, when their heads would have burst open and they would have, gone through all these terrible things. But, you don't open the Ark of the Covenant to look at it, all right? That's not allowed. You don't peer. And even if it hadn't peered, if they had handled it they didn't know how to handle the Ark. They weren't Kohanim. They weren't Levites. They didn't know how to handle the Ark. No ordinary Israelites had been exposed to the Ark before. In some way, they treated it with a lack of respect. At least that's what they thought. Now, from a more logical point of view, if the plague started on the seaside in Philistia, it is quite possible that when the ark was transferred back, among the items that whatever they returned, they may have been returning some plague as well. I don't know whether the mice were the plague or whatnot, but it would make sense to say, because there was no plague in Israel prior to this time, the plague seemed to strike them after the ark returned from the Philistine cities. So the logical answer would be that when the ark returned, it brought with it the affliction that had devastated the Philistines, and that the result was that it spread this contagion to the people of Beit Shemesh. Okay. Now, so that's what happened. They were struck. They felt, or they interpreted it as because they were not respectful. They did not deal with the ark with respect. They didn't know how to deal with the ark, really. So they send to their neighbors. This is the interesting part. They send to a neighboring community called Beit Ya'arim, which wasn't far from the area of Beit Shemesh. They say, look, the Ark of the Covenant came into our midst. It suddenly appeared and we had it. It's here now. And we have the ark and we offered offerings to God and thanksgiving, but we're having a terrible time. God is unhappy with us and we're suffering these great calamities. Why don't you guys who know better how to deal with this, send someone down to take the ark and take it to your town, get it out of here. All right. And that's what they do. These men of Beit Ya'arim, which is a nearby community, they come down and they bring, to Kiryat Ya'arim, they bring the ark to their own home, to their own place, and they place it in the house of a man called Aminadav. We don't know too much about Aminadav. We don't know who he was. But Aminadav obviously was someone who had some kind of reason to have the ark. And Aminadav appoints his son, Eleazar, to watch over the ark. So Eleazar is turned into a kind of a watchman, a guardian of the ark. Now, there's a question that some of you are going to be asking yourselves. Why wasn't the ark returned to where it originally was in Shiloh? Okay. The question should be, well, wait a second. The ark was taken out of the sanctuary in Shiloh, and Shiloh was where it should have gone back to. Why didn't it go back to Shiloh? Anybody have any theory on why it didn't go back to Shiloh? Go ahead, Jerry.
Is it because Eli's sons treated it with disrespect?
Eli's sons treated it with disrespect. Eli and his family lost the right to the priesthood. And interestingly enough, although you'd have to read the commentaries, other commentaries, Shiloh isn't there anymore. As a secondary effect, after the ark was taken, Shiloh was actually destroyed. The Philistines actually made an incursion into Shiloh, and the Mishkan was done away with. There was no Mishkan. Go ahead, Michael.
So then, where was Samuel? This theory that Shiloh was destroyed. Where was Samuel at this time?
All right.
I just assumed he was.
Yeah, we don't know where Samuel was. What had happened? We know there was a general paralysis of will at the time of the war. Eli's sons had died. Israel had suffered a tremendous defeat on the battlefield. Eli himself passed away. Everything was in disarray. Now, there is nothing that says, by the way, that Shiloh was destroyed, okay? But you have to answer this question. If Shiloh was not destroyed, if the sanctuary remained, the ark should have gone back to Shiloh because there were other priests who could have officiated. There were other priests. The fact that it was not means that it could not. And by the way, you're going to see some interesting things now. If you've read further in the chapters, you're going to see that Samuel begins offering sacrifices on high places. Did you notice that? Well, you will. Suddenly, sacrifices aren't offered outside Shiloh anymore. That cannot be unless, as long as there is a permanent site for the temple, sacrifices can only be offered in that permanent site. For example, when the tabernacle was built and the Mishkan existed during the 38 years of wandering and during the years of the conquest by Joshua and the judges, the ark remained in one specific place, and sacrifices could only be brought, important sacrifices could only be brought to the national shrine, the national sanctuary of Shiloh. With Shiloh's destruction during the period of the late judges, Samuel, and then into the period of the monarchy, up until David, we're worshiping on high places again. Why? Because the permanent sanctuary doesn't exist again until a man by the name of David buys a threshing floor in Jerusalem to provide the new home for the ark. So during the interim periods when the ark a permanent place does not exist, we Jews carry around the portable sanctuary. By the way, it's true today. There is no temple today. We don't have to worry about sacrifice. You can't, but in an earlier time, and if you lived in Israel, if the sanctuary didn't exist, you could resort to a high place, a sacred spot. But nowadays, there is no alternative site. There's only the permanent sanctuary. Jerusalem is eternally holy, even when it doesn't exist. So Shiloh did not exist. You couldn't bring the ark back to Shiloh. The men of Beit Shemesh didn't want it. They sent it to Kiryat Yearim, and that is where it remained, by the way. The ark remains in Kiryat Yearim until the time of King David. King David will take it from there and bring it back to Jerusalem, where he will prepare for it a home. Okay? So that answers the question. That answers the second question that we had addressed, which was, the first question, what happened to the ark afterward? It was placed in a home. It remained in that home for a long period of time. The period of time from Samuel to David's setting it up, it probably was there for 70, 80 years. It was probably in a non-permanent location. Okay, now the next question. What happens after this? We are told in the very next section about a gathering in a place called Mitzpah. And before I talk about Mitzpah, let me talk a little bit about what it was like. What was life like in Israel after the defeat at the hands of the Philistines? There was no more Eli and his sons. There were other priests. And by the way, the other thing is that if there is no official sanctuary, then as well as the priests, other liturgical individuals, including Levites, are allowed to bring up offerings on high places. You'll see that Samuel, who is not a priest, is able to bring offerings. That's only because it did not take place in an official Mishkan or tabernacle or sanctuary. So you have life in Israel returning to some kind of normality. Who was the leader at the time? We don't know. No other leaders mentioned. As a matter of fact, after this episode here of the ark and we are told the following. Okay, it said, okay, from the time the ark was stationed in Kiryat Yearim, there ensued many days. There were 20 years during which the entire house of Israel was drawn after Hashem. Okay, what does it mean? What does that mean? It means that following the terrible calamity that had occurred to them, the Jewish people for a while were repentant. They really regretted what they had done. They interpreted their national defeat, the loss of their armies to the Philistines. They determined, they decided, interpreted that the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, the death of Eli's sons, they said all this was a punishment for Israel's sins. It was a way of God visiting judgment upon the Jewish people. And therefore, for a period of 20 years following the return of the ark, the Jewish people, as they often did in periods of judges, you know the cycle. You sin against God, God sends an oppressor, the oppressor oppresses, you cry out to God, God sends a deliverer or a judge, the judge saves you, and then for a period of time afterwards, the people are on the straight and narrow again until they go off and they commit another transgression. Well, it turns out that the 20 years that followed this period of the ark being captured were relatively good years for the Jewish people. Who was their leader? The answer was basically Samuel. Samuel was the last judge of Israel. You're going to see he was different than the other judges, but Samuel is the last judge of Israel. So he marks the transition between the period of the judges and the period of the kings. So Samuel is doing what judges do. What do judges do? He's teaching the people. He's going from place to place. You'll see this in a little while. And he's listening to cases and people are bringing him questions and he's deciding issues. So Samuel is a judge, but Samuel is not only a judge. Unlike other judges of Israel, Samuel was also a prophet. So people would come to Samuel with questions that were normally not the kinds of questions you would ask a judge. A judge, you ask about the law. What should we do in this case and that case? A prophet, we're in this situation, we're facing this situation. What does God want us to do? A judge can't tell you that, but a prophet can tell you that. A prophet can give you that information. And so Samuel was not only a judge and a leader, but he was also a prophet. And in addition to that, he wears a lot of hats, remember. He's a Nazirite and he's a Levite. He's also performing ritual functions. So he's kind of combining a ritual responsibility, a judgeship, a teaching responsibility, and also he's functioning as a prophet. Samuel is, I told you before, next to Moses, he's probably the most important person after the time of Moses. He fills a much more important position than Joshua. Joshua was essentially a very brave military leader who was a prophet who God did favor and bless. But Samuel's function was much more important than Joshua's in a sense. And he was certainly more of a figure and a leader than any of the temporary judges who judged individual tribes. Samuel was as close as the people had to Moses, all right? And obviously times must have been very good because the people were doing well. The people were functioning. As the text says, the text says that they were drawn to the Lord, which meant they were faithful again to Hashem. And at a certain point along this period, when Samuel, obviously he sees he's making progress, he decides to convene a great assembly in this place called Mitzvah. I'm going to read you the verse and then I'm going to ask you the question. All right. Samuel said to the entire house of Israel, if you are returning unto the Lord with all your hearts, then remove the foreign gods, the idols, in other words, and the Ashtarot from your midst. Direct your hearts to Hashem, serving him alone, he will rescue you from the hand of the Philistines. So the children of Israel removed the Baalim and the Ashtaroth, these foreign idols, and they served Hashem alone. This is part of this process. Samuel must have been preaching, you had these problems before because you weren't faithful to God. He was urging the people to get rid of their idolatrous practices that they had assimilated from their Canaanite neighbors around them. And slowly Samuel was making an inroad. The people were giving up. They were returning back to the Lord. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mitzvah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mitzvah. They drew water and poured it out before the Lord, before Hashem, and they fasted that day, and they said, we have sinned unto the Lord, and Samuel judged the children of Israel at Mitzvah. This was a national revival meeting. This is what you have here. Samuel sees that his work is successful. The people are turning away from Canaanite practices. Samuel says, finally, you have shown that you understood the lesson of the past. Let us now renew your relationship with God. Now that you've turned away from your idols, and now that you have rejected the Canaanite idolatrous practices of the people around you, let's go to Mitzvah, which was a central center, and let us renew this covenant again in a ceremony of confession and repentance, okay? You get the idea. Offering offerings, fasting, confessing your sins, pouring water. These are all signs of repentance and contrition. So what Samuel was saying to the people was, you've begun to learn the lesson. Now is the time to return to God. The people as one assemble at Mitzvah, and there at Mitzvah, they confess before the Lord. And then it says, finally, Samuel judged the people at Mitzvah, meaning Samuel had finally established this relationship between the people and God at Mitzvah. Now, around this time, something happens. The Philistines heard that the children of Israel had gathered at Mitzvah, and the governors of the Philistines came up against the children of Israel. All right. So now here's the next question. All right. Jewish people have returned to God. They've asked God to forgive them. They've gotten rid of their foreign fetish idols. Samuel has said, we are now renewing your faith as it was supposed to be. How? Well, you know how. How did the Philistines react to this Israelite gathering at Mitzvah, and why? What was the reaction of the Philistines when they saw this large national gathering at Mitzvah? What do you think they assumed? What do you think their assumption was? Go ahead, Joseph.
They had to see, the tribes coming together as a nation, and they got afraid that coming together as a nation was a powerful force, and they were going to attack.
Yeah, they misunderstood. They took a religious revival ceremony, which had brought all the tribes together, and they saw it as the beginning of military moves. Because why did tribes amass and gather together? Well, you might do it for a national repentance day, where you're all coming together and you're declaring your allegiance to God. But the Philistines saw this, all the people from different tribes coming together as a common group to Mitzvah, and you know what they thought? The Israelites are preparing to attack us. We got a war on our hands again. We've had some prosperity, some quiet for a while, but obviously the Israelites didn't learn the lesson the last time. So we better deal with them. And that's exactly how they interpreted it. And it says as in following, the Philistines heard that the children of Israel had gathered together at Mitzvah, and the governors of the Philistines came up against Israel. So they respond by amassing troops or forces of their own, and they begin to approach Mitzvah. Now, Israel isn't such a big land. If the Philistines have gathered forces, before too long, the people, even while they're still gathered at Mitzvah, probably have heard that the Philistines have responded to their religious ceremony by gathering together in battle. And the people, of course, assume the worst, right? Oh my God, no, we're turning to God, we're doing everything right, and now we're being attacked by our enemy, okay? And so they turn to Samuel, okay? How can this be? It says here, the children of Israel said to Samuel, do not be, okay, it said the children of Israel heard and were afraid of the Philistines. They said to Samuel, do not be silent from crying out on our behalf to the Lord our God, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. Samuel took a suckling lamb. He offered it up entirely as an elevation offering, and the offering was accepted. And when the Philistines approached to battle, Samuel was offering up the elevation offering when the Philistines approached for battle with Israel. The Lord then thundered with a great noise on that day against the Philistines and confounded them so that they were defeated by Israel. The men of Israel went out from Mizpah. They pursued the Philistines, striking them down until beneath Bet Karab. It's a location. Samuel then took a rock, placed it between Mizpah and the cliff, and called it Even HaEzer, the rock of help, saying, Hashem has helped us until this point. The Philistines were humbled, and they no longer continued to enter the borders of Israel, and the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the rest of the days of Samuel. Okay, so now the tide has turned. After the terrible defeat of the Jewish people at the hands of the Philistines sometime before, after the loss of the ark and the death of Eli and his sons, and the loss of so many Israelite forces in that battle, time had passed. Israel was again restored to its God. Peace had returned to the land. The ark was back. And on top of all this, when the Philistines came against the Israelis, this time they didn't win. On the contrary, it was just the opposite. The Lord routed the Philistines. And when the Lord routs an enemy, it just means you're doing what's right by the Lord. And not only did they rout them in this battle, but obviously routed them so decisively whenever this battle took place that the Philistines, for the rest of Samuel's reign, did not make any further incursions into the land of Israel. In other words, the Philistines were obviously beat to such an extent that they didn't attempt to invade Israel again. This is a decisive moment, okay? This is a high point. Okay, so the low point was with the last battle. This is the high point. Let's see, all right. How do the fellows gather? Why? All right. So now Samuel is the ruler. Samuel is the judge. Okay. So let me read to you, again briefly, about the judgeship of Samuel, and I'm going to ask you the next question. Okay? And by the way, not only did the Israelites have peace from the Philistines, but this was the period when they had peace from their other enemies too. It says, the cities that the Philistines had taken from Israel reverted to Israel from Ekron to Gath. So cities that Israel had lost in previous battles to the Philistines, they regained them. And then it says, and Israel rescued the surrounding areas from the hand of the Philistines. Furthermore, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. So it was a period in which Israel was not only being harassed and oppressed by the Philistines, their most difficult enemy, it was a period in which Israel had a certain period of relief from external enemies in general. Now, this is the Samuel period. Listen to what it says. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. Remember, Samuel was dedicated by his mother to serve the people all of his life. Samuel judged Israel all of his life. He would travel year after year, circling from Bethel to Gilgal and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all those places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there he would judge Israel, and there he built an altar for the Lord. Okay, so basically, and the rest of Samuel's reign as a judge was past being a judge. But Samuel was a very different kind of judge than the judges we previously met. And that's what the next question asks. How is the leadership of Samuel as the last judge of Israel different from that of his predecessor judges, okay? Samuel was a different kind of a judge than the others. And as a result, Israel enjoyed a different kind of a fate than it did in an earlier period. What was the difference between the judgeship of Samuel and that of the previous judges? Anybody want to try that one? Okay, Michael, and then Jerry.
Well, one of the differences was he was a traveling judge. He'd go from town to town. They wouldn't have to come to him.
All right.
So that's the biggest difference that I've got.
Right. He was an itinerant judge. Okay. He rode the circuit. Okay. He wasn't stationary in one place, as Michael just said, and everybody came to him. He made it a point to travel around. Now, you don't know what the distance is. It basically is in the part of Israel from the middle up toward the north. Samuel's territory, if he was a circuit judge, his area of his major area, because he couldn't travel all through the land, even though Israel isn't a big land, Samuel was getting older. He didn't travel all over, but he did travel. And rather than people coming to Samuel, he brought judgment to them. He was a circuit or a rotating judge. How does that make a difference? Besides being easier for the people, how does that make it better for the tribes? Anybody else? Or Jerry, you had wanted to say something? Go ahead.
Yes, I was going to comment that he was the traveling judge, and in so traveling, not only is he seeing the geography and the beautiful land, but he's meeting all the various tribes personally. So he's getting to know them as well as the tribes are getting to know him and to see his faith in God.
Very good. Now you're getting close to a national leader again. Instead of being a judge of one tribe or maybe two tribes, as the previous judges were, there were local people who came from tribes and dealt with local problems. Samuel, by traveling, is in a way uniting the nation. What he's saying is Israel is not one tribe or two tribes. Israel is all of the people. And to the extent that I can, in my travels and in my teaching and in my leadership for Israel, I'm going to try through my contact with all of these tribes, I'm going to try and bring Israel together. Okay, very, very important. What Samuel is doing, he's saying, look, what Israel needs is to be united. The fault of Israel in the past was not only that it gave in to local influences and assimilationist forces and followed the ways of the native peoples. The other fault was that it wasn't unified. For good or evil, I am the judge of Israel, and Israel looks to me, and Israel respects me, and Israel sees me as being a leader and as a prophet. Therefore, I'm going to work myself tirelessly throughout my life to be able to serve Israel. By the way, do you know how old, according to tradition, Samuel was when he died? This will shock you. 52 years old. Okay, 52 years old. Okay. Now, that's not old by Jewish standards. Even by biblical standards, that's not old. And the rabbis comment upon the fact that he was so young. He literally worked himself to death. I mean, Samuel devoted himself entirely to the life of his people. So his years were not many, but they were extensive. He traveled, he extended himself. He lived in those 52 years a very active, committed life. And therefore, he expended all the energy he could in the time that he had to the betterment of his people. This was how he was different. He was different as a judge because he was no longer just a military figure, no longer someone just who arose to help Israel militarily. He was truly a judge in the sense that he offered counsel, teaching, learning, judgment to Israel. But as well as that, he was also a kind of a prophet to communicate the message of God to the people. And he was also a religious functionary. He was an everything in one. He was an all in one. He was the whole Megillah, okay? He was the whole Megillah, the whole Mishagatz, all right? He was everything. All right, so that's great. Go ahead, Mike, you have a question.
Wait a minute.
You're on, you're good.
So he was the Moses following the example of Jethro, have set up lower judges or lower arbitrators or whoever they were, and they all knew him as the new Moses, and he was also a prophet. So he had a lot of time going from his daily problems up to God now.
Right. Yeah. Perfect, Mike. He took advantage of Moses's lesson. There were local judges in the areas, obviously, but Samuel, as a prophet and as a national figure, could go from place to place, and if there were issues that had to be addressed, he could address them. So yes, he is you have to be careful here. There is no one like Moses, but as close as you could get to a Moses figure since the time of Moses, Samuel is it. Samuel is the Moses figure of his time. He is the complete leader. He is the prophet. He is the Levite, like Moses was. He is he's an officiant. He serves. He is a judge like Moses was. He's a teacher like Moses was. He's even unlike Moses, he was even a Nazirite. He had it all. But yes, that's the case. Any other observations before we go on? Does anybody have any points they would like to make? Observations, counter sermons, anything like that? Anybody? Okay. All right. So things are going very well. And then comes the problem. Okay. If everything was going so hunky-dory, and Israel had peace from the Canaanites, peace from the Canaanites, yes, and peace from the Philistines, and peace from the Amorites, and was enjoying a period of return to God, and everything was going well, and the tribes were beginning to see themselves as united, why suddenly now, in chapter 8, are the people asking Samuel for a king? Okay? Why are the people asking Samuel for a king? And the answer is suggested in chapter 8. Take a look at what it says. When Samuel became old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. Okay, the old man can't go farther anymore, all right? Samuel's getting older. He can't be on the road as much anymore. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second son was Abiah. And they were judges in Beersheba. Now, do any of you know where Beersheba is located in the land of Israel? Any of you have an idea where, Diane, do you know where Beersheba is located? Geographically speaking, in relation to the rest of Israel, where is it?
More in the south, I
The
think.
south.
Yeah.
Samuel was able to cover the northern areas, but you had tribes way down in the south, right? So Samuel couldn't be everywhere at every time. So what did he do? In addition to the other judges who judged locally, Samuel said, I got two sons and someday I'm going to be out of the business and I want to really put up my awning, Samuel and Sons, prophets and judges or whatnot. So he said, I'm going to bring my sons into the business. And so Samuel brings his sons into the business. He says, I'm going to set them up. And they're going to handle for me the south part of the country. I'll handle the north part. I'll be here. My sons will take care of jurisdiction. Their circuit will be in the southern half of the country from the middle down. Okay? But his sons did not follow in his ways. They were swayed by profit. They took bribes and they perverted judgments. Uh-oh. See the problems? Okay? Reminds you of someone, doesn't it? Reminds you of another episode of another good man named Eli, who also had two sons and who also brought his sons into the family business as priests. And unfortunately, the sons weren't like the father and they went astray. And they were guilty of the same sin, apparently, as the sin of Samuel's sons. What were Samuel's sons guilty of? According to the text, what was their sin? What made them worse or not the same example as their father? What were they guilty of? They weren't sleeping with women at the temple, I can tell you that. And they weren't stealing sacrifices. But what does the text say? Why were the sons judged as being inferior? Go ahead, Diane.
It says they were bent on gain, they accepted bribes, and they subverted justice.
All right. They saw their position not as an office to serve their people. They saw their position as a way to serve themselves. Same kind of sin that Eli's sons, right? If you are given the task of being a leader for your people, you are either a faithful leader, which means you are a servant to your people's needs, or you're a rapacious leader who's out for your own, and you claim to be for the people, but really what you're about is taking as much advantage and gaining as much profit as you can from your position. Unfortunately, Samuel's sons were the second kind of people. Despite the fact that they had an illustrious father, or maybe because of that, despite the fact that their father was famous, was well known, was honored throughout the community of Israel, the sons probably felt, well, dad is the big man in the community and we're his sons, we're his successors. And, people are going to expect us to take over when dad's gone. And so they saw themselves in the same light as they saw their father, but they weren't the same kind of men and they didn't serve God from the same pure motives that Samuel served God. They were really serving themselves, right? Now, the people see this. The people are not stupid, right? What do they see? They see Samuel's getting old. Samuel's not going to be able to continue the job forever. He's getting old. He's going to leave us. and he's going to leave a gaping hole in the leadership of Israel. We are not going to have a figure like Samuel to unite us. And as for his sons, even if we haven't told Samuel this, his sons are garnished. They're not worth anything. They're not reputable people, and we can't depend upon them to lead us after they're gone. Just because their father was a great leader isn't going to make them great leaders. So now the people have a dilemma. They see that Samuel's days are ending. They see that his sons are not worthy successors for them. And they are afraid that with the loss of Samuel, they're going to go back to a time when they had no leadership, right? So what do? Take a listen. Okay, it says, all the elders of Israel then gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. Ramah, by the way, was Samuel's home. Ramah, by the way, is the same place his parents came from Time Sophia. That's where his parents were from. He lived in his home. The elders of the people come. Notice, not the people in general, the elders come, because the elders know what the problem is. They see that there is going to be a leadership gap when Samuel is gone. And the elders of the people gathered together and they came to Samuel and they said, you have grown old and your sons do not follow your ways. So now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now you see what the people's concern is? They're saying, look, Samuel, things have been good. But we live in fear of what's going to happen. You're getting older. Your sons are not the men you were. And furthermore, we fear the time when you're gone, there's going to be a gap in leadership, and we're not going to have a figure to unite us like you've managed to unite us and bring us back to God. And therefore, we, like other nations, need a national leader. We want you to appoint a king for us. Joseph, go ahead.
When I read that part about we want a king like other nations, I also thought that, you know, the established old nations, great powers had kings, and I thought that perhaps that meant that the people, the elders, wanted to not view themselves any longer as a collection of tribes, but as a great nation equal to these other nations. And a way to demonstrate that is to have a king like other great nations have a king. It seemed like they were maturing. Israel was maturing to a point where they wanted to be a great nation and be respected as a great nation, and having a king seemed to be the status, you know. That
Okay, so the next step was to have a king. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, and to anticipate your next question, so Samuel doesn't know what to do, goes to God and says, what should I do? And he says, all right, they want to have a king, they have all these problems, give them a king.
All right, but before we get to God's response, let's get, what would be the reasons? Let me ask you this question, and then we'll go to the last part of our session today. Okay, what would be the reason for people wanting a king? What are the normal reasons you want a king for? You want a king, number one, to fight your battles, right? Just like the United States to provide for common defense, right? You need a king, you need a strong government to protect you from outside enemies. All right. So we want a king who will go forth in front of us to battle and will bring our troops out in safety and bring them back home in safety. But right now, Israel is enjoying safety, right? Why? Because so long as they're faithful to God, God's going to protect them. They don't need an earthly human king to do it. So long as they remain, here's the thing, other nations may need kings. As long as Israel is faithful to God, they don't need a human king. But the people are saying, you know, other nations have kings. Kings take nations out to battles, they unify them. We need a king to unify us like other people. We need a king to take us out to battle like other leaders of nations do. Why else besides going out to battle and as a symbol of national unity, why else might people want a king? What other reasons might there be besides for the sake of battle or for the sake of a representation of national unity? Joseph?
Well, in the period of the judges, there wasn't a constant form of government or a constant leader. They would go through these periods of horrible time, decay, and they had a judge would have to come out of like nowhere or to rise up. So if at least they had a king, that would be a form of government that could be passed on, and they wouldn't have to keep looking at for a new leader, taking 20 years to find a new leader.
Yeah. We can't depend upon God coming up with a judge just in the nick of time every generation if we're worthy. We need someone who is going to be a permanent source of leadership, who will judge us and who will be there. And the office will be passed down from him to the next person. We need a system that is more consistent than the system of judges. We can't rely on prophets, and we can't rely on judges arising at the right time. We want a leader who will rule us, who will judge us. And therein lies the problem. Samuel doesn't take this very well, does he? It says right here, it was wrong in Samuel's eyes that they said, give us a king to judge us, and Samuel prayed to the Lord. Samuel was particularly aggrieved because the people said, not give us a king to rule over us. They said, give us a king to judge us. Samuel, you were, maybe Samuel is afraid. Maybe they didn't think I was a good judge. Maybe they want a different judge than me, as your leader, give us someone else. We're waiting for the next rabbi. You did good, rabbi, but we went the next. Maybe Samuel thought, well, maybe the people's wanting someone else as a judge, a king. Maybe they weren't satisfied with me. Maybe they're rejecting me. Or alternatively, the people have told me they don't respect my children. How do you think a father feels when it says, yeah, you're good, you're okay, but your children, they're not good, they can't follow you. So Samuel may have been upset because he interpreted it as a slur, which it was, upon his children. Maybe Samuel just resented the fact that they said, you're getting old, and they reminded Samuel that he was approaching his latter years. Sue, go ahead.
Well, the problem, it seems, was that Samuel was a great judge, but his sons, who theoretically would be taking his place, fell a little short of that. But why would the people think that appointing a king would not create the same problem?
It's amazing, isn't it? All right, we'll solve the problem of a leadership vacuum of sons who don't follow their leaders by creating a monarchy where we're guaranteed sons who are going to be worse than their fathers. A monarchy, as Sue says, solves nothing. It only guarantees that you may be in for institutional bad leadership generation after generation. And that's what Samuel will point out. He'll say, you think that the problem of being judged and of being unified and of being a whole people is going to be solved by a king. Let me tell you something about royal prerogatives. Let me tell you something about the rulership of kings to awaken you to the disastrous side of hereditary monarchy. Okay, he's good, and that's so Samuel, for a variety of reasons, the people are rejecting me. The people are rejecting my son. The people are telling me I'm too old anymore to do my job. It's time to retire. Or the people are rejecting God. For all these reasons, Samuel is upset. And he turns to God, as you might expect. He was a prophet. And the text says, the Lord said to Samuel, and this is his prophetic, all right? Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for it is not you whom they have rejected, but it is me whom they have rejected from reigning over them. So God, first of all, says to Samuel, look, don't take this personally. It's not you as a leader that they're rejecting. If anything, God says, it's me that they're rejecting. You tried to teach them that if they had faith in me and followed my ways, that they didn't need a human king, that I was their king. In asking you for a king, Samuel, it's not rejecting your role, it's rejecting my role. God is saying that people are really rejecting me. And then God says to Samuel, and by the way, this is nothing new. He goes on to say, like all the deeds that they have done from the day that I brought them up from Egypt until this day, they have forsaken me and worshiped the gods of others. So they are doing to you as well. Just as I've had to deal with this unfaithful people who have gone back and forth, it's not you. They've done it to me. This is the nature of the people. So in their comment to you, do not take it as a personal slight. Do not take it as being any lack of ability on your part. You have served me and you have served the people well. It's me that the people are rejecting by calling for a king, a human king, a king of flesh and blood. They're really saying that I, God, am not sufficient, that they want the human instead of me. And then God says, and now heed their voice, but be sure to warn them and tell them about the protocol of the king who will reign over them. God says they want this, as I said long ago to Moses, if the people want a king, they can have a king. But make sure they understand what they are going to get if they get a king. They shouldn't be able to say later on, oh, we didn't know what we were asking for. Tell them now, what is the matter of royalty and what are the disadvantages of asking for a human king? And that will be next week. We'll talk about that as we enter next week. So you see, we have come now to this critical period of time. Israel is beginning to coalesce. They are beginning to realize that they are a nation that has to come together. They are beginning to realize that the problems of tribal leadership will not solve either their military or their national problems. They begin to look for a national leader. They find it in Samuel, but fearing that Samuel is getting old and his sons will not continue on, and believing that this concept of judgeship may not be permanent enough or stable enough to make them like other nations strong, they turn to Samuel and they say, Samuel, in your capacity as a prophet of God, appoint for us a king, someone whom God will select to be king over us. And Samuel, even though he is very much against it, as you will see next week, does just that. All right, Jerry, go ahead.
Rabbi, you really helped me become enlightened with this incident regarding the people wanting a king. You stated that Samuel died at a relatively youthful old age at 52. So if that's the case, now I can understand from the tribe's viewpoint. They're looking at Samuel. He's ancient at whatever, late 40s, early 50s, and they're concerned about themselves. Now I understand their panic, if you will. Before, I'd always puzzled over that. So now I can see where they're saying we got to do something quick, you know.
Right. And it also explains, Jerry, why, despite the fact that things seem to be going so well, it was particularly now that they wanted a king. There were other more chaotic periods, but now when things were going well, as you said, they were worried that they were going to lose Samuel, that there was no one to replace him, and that they had to make provision now for a more permanent form of leadership. Okay. Now, what's in place here? Philistines and the enemies of Israel are still around about. God has protected Israel from them, but whenever God will cease his protection, they're going to be vulnerable. So now Samuel has three tasks. Task number one, before he agrees to the people's request, he must first give them due warning. He must tell them what they're really asking for and make them understand what they're asking for. One of the questions I will ask you this week is, describe to me the nature of kingship according to Samuel. In other words, according to Samuel, what are the royal prerogatives? What are the dangers of a kingship? Okay, and Samuel does a great job of outlining the dangers. Okay, so how does Samuel, in his warning to the people, try and warn them about the dangers of kingship? Does he do a convincing job of it? And what's the people's reaction to his argument? You will see the people still decide they want to go ahead with the king. So now Samuel says, fine, you have asked for a king. God has decided to grant you the right to have a king. Go back to your homes, to the leaders, go back. Now give me time. I've got to find the right man. Second question, who's going to be king? Okay, people are not going to elect the king. The people are not going to select the king. The elders of the tribes are not going to choose the king. Who's going to choose the king? The king, okay? The real king is going to choose him. In other words, Samuel says, you want a king, that's fine, but you don't choose him. The real king chooses him. God is going to choose him, and God will make known to me the man who is worthy to be king over Israel, and I, when I find this man, will present him to you as your king. Point number two. And then point number three, when Samuel has warned the people about the dangers of kingship, and when he has identified the king, he must then engage in a process by which all of the Jewish people will accept the candidate he has chosen to be their new king. And then that's not an easy thing, all right? When Samuel comes and he says, this is your king, you're going to see there's not a unanimous reaction to it. How is he going to get the people to buy into the candidate that God has told him is the one who is to be king of Israel? That's all coming up this coming week. Okay, that's all coming up. And actually, it's not next Thursday, right, man? Okay, so we're off next Thursday so that I can take my wife. Well, first of all, we're off for a couple of reasons. It's poor, but also it's my wife's birthday. So we're going to go celebrate Randy's birthday. So well, you had a Monday off. Now you have a Thursday off. I'll see you on Monday at Exodus class, but you'll be off next Thursday. So you'll have plenty of time to read the notes on this that we've talked about and look at the next chapters with the notes. And then we will talk about, that's going to be week number 7, 7, 8, and 9 to come. We will talk about Samuel's presentation to the people of the problems of kingship. We will talk about how Samuel came to select the person that he did to serve as king, and then the reaction of the people to his choice, and how eventually that choice, it didn't happen right away, became the unanimous choice of all the people of Israel, because all of the people had to buy into it. So all that will be next week. That will take us to the first king of Israel. I want to remind everybody that this coming Sunday, if you are available, 7 o'clock, my son, Shmuel, will be doing a session on the laws and customs of the holiday of Purim, the 4 special mitzvot and other customs related to the Purim holiday. Also to remind everybody that this coming Sunday, many congregations are having Purim carnivals. So if you want to go to a Purim carnival, you'll probably find one at your local synagogue. This next week, Purim is being celebrated Wednesday night and Thursday. And you will find on both times, Wednesday night and Thursday, places to go to hear the Megillah being read and to participate in the other mitzvot of Purim. Finally, for those of you in Or Chadash, just to remind everybody, tomorrow we are going back to in-person services. Finally, I can say that we are not only we're going to continue to broadcast. So if you cannot make it, we are going to do a combination of a broadcast, a YouTube service. We're going to video it out to people who want to see it at home. But if you want to come, we're going to be at our brand new site, the United Methodist Church in Northridge on Reseda Boulevard near Superior. Information, I think Phyllis has already sent out that information to Or Chadash people, so you have it. So whether I see you tomorrow virtually or in person, I do look forward to seeing you all. And then, believe it or not, a month from this Wednesday night, the holiday of Passover is coming up. Huh?
It's Friday night.
Is it Friday night? First Seder Friday night. A month from this Friday night is the holiday of Passover. So we'll have more to tell you about Passover and some other kinds of things as well. Once again, thank you all for being here. Once again, if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim, gifts to the poor, which is one of the 4 traditional mitzvot of the holiday of Purim. Traditionally, we've always given, many people give to local community charities and whatnot, food banks and whatnot. May I suggest that you still do that, but you might also want to make a contribution to one of the many Ukrainian charities that are helping people now in this very devastating time in the history of the world, actually. And so you might, in addition to any local charity, you might want to supplement it with a gift to one of the Ukrainian charities as well. And with that, I wish you all a good evening.
Just wanted to say, we will finally be the same time as you next week.
Oh, that's right. Yes, yes. Oh, thank you. This coming Sunday, remember to set your clocks ahead 1 hour. We're going ahead 1 hour. That makes us the same as you, Marlene?
Yeah, because we're an hour later than you, so we don't have to wait till 8 o'clock.
You don't have to wait. All right. So we're in sync next week. Arizona, Royce, we're going back to 7 o'clock time.
We don't change time here.
You don't change time. We change time. All right.
Yeah, you guys do.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night. Have a good
Happy
week.
birthday, Randy.
Happy birthday, Randy.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank
Okay,
you're
thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Shabbat shalom.
I can't find it.
We should stop
But I could
recording.
just touch it.
Okay.
Just touch it.
Okay.